defeat the Catholic Church. Anti-Catholic, like, stereotypical view of Catholics, which was smells and bells and rituals, right, and an obsession with Mary. I continued to grow up in a home where, you know, regular church attendance was just a de facto norm of everyday life. Reading the Bible every day was a de facto norm of everyday life. Praying with my parents, we had grace before meals. You know, my dad, his kind of nickname was the God Squad, you know, I mean, in the UK and the country. Well, I thought I was pretty well versed in kind of anti-Catholic, like, I can defeat the Catholic Church, you know, on all doctrinal points. And, you know, kind of classic arrogance of a 12-year-old teenage boy who thinks he knows everything. Was a priest at St. Paul's. So St. Paul's is an Anglican school. It was like a high church Anglican, right, which is kind of Anglo-Catholic, as it's called in the UK. And Anglo-Catholicism is, you know, there's, for example, like, he would genuflect when he walked into the church. This was something which was totally opposite to how I grew up. You know, the service that he conducted was done in vestments. Again, something completely opposite to how I grew up. You know, he basically started defending Catholic viewpoints. So I walked into the classroom being like, this is it. Yep, I'm good. I know the answers. And I started spouting off about, you know, he and I kind of had quite a few classes together, and really by the kind of age of 15, I think I was in the thick of trying to defeat him on Catholic theology. I was battling with this question of Catholic theology. You know, I was kind of baffled by how defending, for example, like sacramental theology. So, you know, I walked in and basically said, well, the sacraments deny the effects of grace. You know, like, to say that you require the sacraments is an obstacle to knowing God, and therefore, like, you can't be justified by faith alone if you require the sacraments, right? And this priest, his name's Patrick Alsop, he, you know, I remember vividly having this conversation with him where he was just like, well, the sacraments are all about grace. Like, they are actually exactly about grace. This is the whole point. And I didn't really have an answer to this. You know, I didn't have an answer to any of these points that he raised, because having been raised in a home that was not anti-Catholic, I guess, but it was anti-Catholic, but it was more just that Catholicism and Catholic teaching wasn't taught. Like, why would it be taught? You know, we were not Catholics, so why would it matter? And, you know, there was a kind of stereotypical view of Catholics, which was smells and bells and rituals, right, and an obsession with Mary. Never really been any coherent intellectual debate about Catholic doctrinal points. It had all just been an echo chamber. And as a result, when I walked in to start to try and attack the points that I had been raised in this echo chamber to attack, I had very little to fight back against when sound doctrinal arguments were put back to me, right? And this is what he started to do. This is what Father Alsop started to do. Kind of in the same way that people who have profound religious experiences and people who have political conversions often become more zealous than anyone else. For me, that was the first step. More questions by this point. So another very big thing, which I think is interesting, is that my church, St. Helens at the time, basically, you know, it's kind of like, I started asking the question. I was like, well, what happened before the Reformation? You know, do we just believe that nothing happened before? Like, what happened to Christianity for the first 1500 years? I was very inquisitive about this, and I kind of didn't shut up asking these questions. I'm like, well, and then what was funny was that there were a couple of Christian teachers who, like evangelical teachers, like this, I think I'm going to get his name wrong, but I think there's one called Gary Lennox, who I remember we went on Christian summer camp every year, which was for the whole family, and he gave a talk series on the early church, or like on the first 1500 years. And I was so excited to listen to the series, because I was like, wow, this is going to answer the questions that I have about what happened before the Reformation. I mean, he basically started off by saying there were lots of Christians before the Reformation. It's just that you kind of had to seek them out. You had to kind of look into the writings of the bishops, and you did find quite a few Christians. And as soon as he sort of said that, it kind of triggered in my mind, well, like, hang on a sec, so what are we saying here? Like, and then all these questions, I mean, all the questions that so many Catholics I know have been through themselves when they asked themselves these questions, kind of started coming up. Because then he was saying that, you know, there were like bishops from 11th century Spain who were talking about the effects of grace and how justification by faith alone was, you know, was doctrinally sound and all this kind of, and as soon as he started saying this, I realized that there was a Christian church before it. It wasn't that the church had just started in, you know, the date that Henry VIII decided that he wanted to get divorced from Anne Boleyn. You know, Catherine of Aragon even. He wanted to get married to Anne Boleyn, but there was a church which existed before this. And now, of course, when I look back on it, it's kind of funny, because that's a question that, like, if there's a book called Crossing the Tiber by Stephen Ray, and, you know, Stephen writes in that book, like, former Baptist was the early church Catholic and then became Protestant, or was the early church Protestant and then became Catholic, right? And where my faith was at this point, I was like, well, hang on a sec, like, was the early church Catholic or Protestant? And then for me, that elicited like hundreds more questions.
With a professor, and he says, all right, so he just started learning about the church fathers. And so he says, okay, so you're telling me if I got into a time machine, and he said, I still remember the way the professor looked at me, like he used some kind of sci-fi nut. If I got into a time machine and went all the way back, I would feel more comfortable as a Christian in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century than a Catholic would. And the professor said, exactly. And he thought, okay, good. So now all I got to do is go back and read what these early Christians taught, and I'll convince myself that they were all Calvinists. And you know the rest of the story. He's a Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. I've reached a limit of everything that I can know under this branch of church teaching. Right? I'm coming up against all these roadblocks. There's no answers for what happened to Christianity before the Reformation. There's no concept of Christian unity. They're not even interpreting Scripture, using Scripture to confirm what Scripture says. There's no church hierarchy, like where's the central authority? You know, there's no concept of apostolic succession, like, you know, even things like in the Acts of the Apostles where, you know, the handkerchief and the shadow, you know, are being used to cure people. Well, like, here's a great example of relics, you know, like there is a clear definition of sainthood of relics. All of these doctrinal Catholic points, I mean, at this point I was, you know, I was basically already there by this point.
Were you reading Catholic books at this point, or just asking questions?
So I started to read Catholic books.
What was the first book you remember reading?
So, I mean, I went straight in with the heavy stuff. I mean, Cardinal Ratzinger, Principles of a Catholic Theology.
Wonderful.
Was the first one that I read.
Wonderful. Is this when you were at Oxford? Or?
This was just before I was at university, so this was when I was 17. And, you know, I was just like, okay, we're going to go straight in with the heavy guns. You know, I was like, I knew this guy. I didn't know much about Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, or Pope Benedict as he was then. But I just knew that he was supposed to be a preeminent theologian within the church. And that was kind of what I had heard about him. And Catholic intellectual theologian. And like the flip side being all of these questions that I couldn't get answered. So I just thought, maybe he's got some answers. Right? And so I started reading his work. And that was kind of like, I mean, by that point I was there. You know, I mean, it was just, I was like, okay.
Had you attended Holy Mass at this point?
No, I hadn't. I was too frightened to go to Mass. I used to go, well, so that's, I mean, I had gone to Mass and I had just sat at the back of the church. So Westminster Cathedral, which is the mother church of England, really. I mean, it's the one where
the coronation takes place?
Well, no, that's Westminster Abbey, right? But Westminster Cathedral is the big Catholic cathedral in London, right beside Westminster Abbey. And it's where the cardinal, you know, traditionally the UK cardinal has his seat. And
that was that given back to the Catholics?
It was built by the Catholics in the 19th century.
Oh, okay.
So kind of like at the height. So England's Catholicism is quite a funny story because basically in the late, I mean, obviously John Henry Cardinal Newman, you know, Saint John Henry Cardinal, very well-known Catholic thinker, but his original movement, the Oxford movement as it was called, you know, was actually a revival of the Church of England, right? And this is kind of not that many people understand this. It was traditionally considered to be like an area where people were trying to get to understand the Church of England more. And then what happened was he became Catholic, and this kind of shook. I mean, it was seismic. I mean, it's funny to think now, like I always like these little kind of anecdotes from history, but like just how much faith played a role in the mind of generations before us. You know, like I studied Byzantine history when I was at university, and like there's this great story, and I'm sure it's familiar to many people, but like there's some big monastery in Constantinople at the time, and one of the monks wants to go down to the market to get a loaf of bread, and it's kind of in the mid of the Nestorian crisis, you know, the Nestorian kind of councils, and he basically gets mobbed on his way to the market by this crowd of people arguing about the nature of Christ. You know, I'm just like, and yeah, you know, we've got like Lizzo twerking, you know, nowadays. It's just like, it's like and we claim that we're getting smarter as a human race. I'm just like, well, hang on a second. Like, you've got a crowd of, you've got an angry mob in Constantinople arguing about the dual nature of Christ, and now we've got like, you know, TikTok. You know, it's just kind of like this chasm of intellectual thought between where we were then and where we are now. And but Westminster Cathedral was built in the latter half of the 19th century because England went through this great Catholic revival, which was really the first time that England had a Catholic revival for almost 300 years, and it was led by John Henry Cardinal Newman at the time, and so he kind of spearheaded that movement. But Westminster Cathedral is this beautiful Byzantine-style church in London. I mean, it's very dark. It kind of reminds me a little bit of St. Mark's in Venice, which is one of my favorite churches. And I went and sat in the back of Westminster Cathedral and just kind of sat there for many, like I prayed a rosary for the first time. I kind of didn't even know what I was doing. I had to kind of look up how to do it. So I sat at the back of the church. I watched the Mass several times. I was trying to understand what was going on. And for me, that was just kind of, I felt at home almost straight away.
I remember the first time I realised how similar the High Anglican liturgy was to Holy Mass. I was in Adelaide looking for a church shortly after my conversion, and so I still didn't know a lot of things. I show up at this cathedral, so I thought, well, that's Catholic. And so I went in and was kneeling, and I thought, isn't it funny they had a British flag? It's just different, you know? And then a woman came out and went, nope, and I'm going, in the vestments.
Yeah, so that sounds about